Here for everyone.
So now we are on YouTube live from now onwards, 1300 hours.
Okay. Shall we start then?
So I think so. Others can join in. So.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon and Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to this third webinar of Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. We have with us Ambassador Zamir Akram, who is the principal keynote speaker, and he'll be joined by Dr. Adil from CAS and Ms. Sitara Noor, who is a senior research associate, also to speak on the subject. I assure the attendees that we have an interesting discussion in store for us because these speakers have been dealing with the subject for many, many years. The webinar was meant to be timed with Yom Takbir. However, due to unavoidable circumstances and due to Eid holidays, it had to be postponed to today. Ladies and gentlemen, Pakistan's nuclear capability demonstration in May 1998 was a very consequential event in the perennial arms race unleashed in the region by India since partition. In a very difficult economic situation, Pakistan has barely been able to keep its head above water to maintain the credibility of its conventional and nuclear deterrence. Failing to do this would have allowed India to run amok and do some silly things to disrupt the peace in the region. It is an oft repeated cliche that nuclear weapons are for deterrence only and are not meant for war fighting. So when Pakistan became a nuclear armed state, it thought that it had managed to secure itself. But the history since then has proven otherwise. Since 1998, India has been itching for a fight and to prove that there is room for conventional conflict under the nuclear overhang. Pakistan keeps wondering why. Is it arrogance or hubris? The widening gap between the economic power of two neighbors has led India to be more aggressive. The Indian madness has been aggravated under the Hindutva-driven Modi government. They annexed Kashmir by abrogating Article 370 and 35A to cause misery to Kashmiri Muslims in IOK, and then went on to disenfranchise Muslims all over India, passing the Citizen Amendment Act and instituting the National Register for Citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, our Qaid was prescient when he said that at the time of the partition, that those Muslims who stay back in India would continually have to prove their loyalty to India. Today we see Muslims being lynched, denied sharing hospital wards with Hindus, properties not being made available to them on rent, and boycotting of Muslim retail businesses. Even worse, they are being accused of spreading coronavirus at Pakistan's behest. Hindu vigilantism against Muslim has state backing. Their properties are set on fire while the police look on as an interested spectator. So what is evident is that Hindu hostility has been unending, and that's the environment in which Pakistan is and has been in trying to seek security and peace. Our panelists will today trace this journey and analyze what it portends for the future. So I will hand over the mic to Dr. Adil Sultan. Thank you.
So thank you very much for these opening remarks. I'm Adil Sultan, one of the directors at Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, looking after analyzing nuclear and strategic affairs. So on behalf of my colleagues at CAS, once again, welcome and good afternoon to everyone on a webinar that is titled Nuclear South Asia, Challenges and Opportunities. So as the President also highlighted, the objective of this webinar was to review the developments both in the military and the civilian or the peaceful uses of nuclear technology over the last 22 years. To contextualize this debate, what we will be discussing in the next 45 minutes, all three panelists, let me read my opening statement and list the questions that we have requested Ambassador Zamir Akram, Ms. Sitara Noor, to address those questions. So it has been more than 2 decades since India and Pakistan formally declared themselves as nuclear weapon states. Both countries are improving their nuclear capabilities, with India trying to emerge as a global power, while Pakistan continues to focus on deterring both conventional as well as nuclear aggression from its larger eastern neighbor. Over the past 2 decades, nuclear weapons have played an important role in maintaining strategic stability in South Asia, and would continue to shape the scope and intensity of the future crises as well. Besides the military-related developments, both India and Pakistan are also expanding their civilian nuclear program to meet their respective socio-economic needs. While India has been given an exceptional treatment by granting waiver from the Nuclear Suppliers Group, a nuclear cartel that regulates civilian nuclear trade, and that came into being after India's nuclear test of 1974, which was a result of diversion of civilian technology for military purposes. So this NSG has granted exemption to India, and now India is eligible to enter into nuclear-related trade with all the NSG countries, while Pakistan continues to face discrimination. To discuss the role of nuclear technology in the military domain, as well as its peaceful applications, we have, like President also introduced, Ambassador Zamir Akram, and Ms. Sitara Noor, and myself. I'll also briefly talk about Pakistan's nuclear program and the developments, what role it has played over the last 22 years. What we intend to do is that we will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes each, and then we will open the forum for question answer session. So you can see there is a window of question and answer. I'll request all the guest participants to write their questions in that window, and in the end, we will try and take as many questions as possible. Just an administrative announcement that in case of any technical glitch or fault, if you go offline, you will immediately receive new password and ID, and we should be able to resume our proceedings within 5 to 10 minutes. So we will start with our first panelist, Ambassador Zamir Akram, who is currently Advisor SPD. Ambassador Akram served for 37 years in foreign service and retired in 2015. His foreign postings included Moscow, New Delhi, Washington, and UN in Geneva, including the Conference on Disarmament. At the headquarters in Islamabad, he has dealt with Afghanistan, South Asia, and the United Nations. So we have requested Ambassador Akram to focus on the following 3 questions, but sir, you are free to add on whatever you feel appropriate. The primary questions are, how has the nuclearization helped bring stability or instability in South Asia? Number 2, are there any lessons from the Cold War nuclear competition between the 2 former superpowers that could be relevant for South Asia? And third, what are the prospects of arms control and confidence building measures between global powers, and what impact it can have for South Asia? Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adil. It's a pleasure for me to join all of you in this webinar this morning. So let me start right away. From my perspective, the perennial problem for Pakistan from the very inception, from its independence, has been to ensure its security against a much larger, much more powerful neighbor, with which it also has some significant disputes, such as Kashmir, and more importantly, a country that has pursued the goal of regional hegemony, which has placed Pakistan's security in jeopardy from time to time. And so for Pakistan, the security imperative is the most important consideration from its foreign policy and its security policy perspective. Prior to the acquisition of a non-weaponized deterrence, or a virtual deterrence, in about mid or late 1980s, when Pakistan's nuclear program had reached that point, a situation of, as I said, non-weaponized deterrence came into being, preventing the outbreak of conflicts which had earlier taken place at the conventional level between India and Pakistan, such as the brass tacks, such as the situation arising from the brass tacks Indian military exercises, and in 1990 from the Kashmiri uprising. This indicated that even a virtual non-weaponized deterrence had brought about a relative situation of strategic stability. After the 1998 tests, this became a overt or weaponized deterrence based on mutual assured destruction. And most importantly, from Pakistan's perspective, the acquisition of nuclear weapons capabilities neutralized the Indian superiority, numerical superiority that had existed in conventional weapons. And so a period, in my view, of relative strategic stability ensued, which led to confidence building measures, a dialogue on security issues, on nuclear issues between India and Pakistan, leading to the Lahore Declaration and some other subsequent agreements as well on confidence building. However, the Indians were uncomfortable with this environment, with the situation, and were keen to reassert the salience of their conventional capabilities, which led them to enunciate doctrines such as Cold Start, which sought the space to fight a conventional war below the threshold of nuclear weapons. And then that led Pakistan to respond by evolving its own technological capabilities, in particular, developing low-yield nuclear weapons and short-range delivery systems like the Nasr missile as part of its doctrine of full-spectrum deterrence. According to this doctrine, we intend to, or we plan to prevent the outbreak of war at the operational, tactical, or strategic levels. However, I want to underline the fact that there is a misconception, even within Pakistan, that full spectrum deterrence is meant to prevent even the outbreak of skirmishes along the LOC or on the international border. It is not. We, as a responsible nuclear weapons state, have to weigh the conditions in which full spectrum deterrence will be triggered. And I think our strategic community and strategic leaders have already outlined the conditions under which nuclear weapons use can be considered. And those conditions expressly state that if there is a threat to Pakistan's security and sovereignty, then we would contemplate using the use of nuclear weapons. We have also said that it will not be an automatic use, but it would be a graduated use depending on the security environment. And so a lot of Indians particularly have been arguing, for instance, that when they carried out their so-called surgical strike in 2016, or when they carried out the attack on Balakot in February last year, that this had exposed Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence because Pakistan did not use nuclear weapons. This is wrong thinking, and I think the Indians really believe in this rhetoric of theirs. They are sadly mistaken, because clearly at no point during these crises did the Indians actually even begin to employ their cold start doctrine. And in the absence of a cold start type of attack, which would have involved a conventional, full-scale conventional attack on Pakistan, the question of invoking full spectrum deterrence did not arise. So that, I think, is a mistaken assessment of full spectrum deterrence, and that needs to be clarified. Now, coming to the present situation, I think the Indians are once again trying to build up the capabilities, both strategic and conventional, to bring back the salience of their conventional weapons, this time by an overwhelming nuclear or strategic capability that would even overwhelm, in their view, Pakistan's resort to full spectrum deterrence if a situation arose to that at that point. They are doing so, I think, by developing ballistic missile defense systems, by developing the entire range of ballistic missiles, short, medium, and long range, submarine launched ballistic missiles, nuclear powered submarines armed with nuclear weapons. They carried out a deterrence patrol, if you remember, apparently with live weapons, carrying out an anti-satellite test, and also working on a new generation of missile systems such as MIRV missiles and the BrahMos cruise missiles, which are supersonic and apparently also working on hypersonic missiles as well. So these are, I think, strategic developments of the future. And we need to respond to those. I'm not one that would argue for an arms race. We do not wish and do not want to engage in such an arms race, but certainly we need to develop the capabilities to respond to the qualitative changes that can come about or are coming about as a result of the Indian technological developments. Incidentally, these developments are also helped in a very big way by some of their allies, in particular by the United States, which is trying to use India as a counterweight to China. And then in the present circumstances, as also in earlier situations that we have seen with Pakistan, now with China, India has been encouraged to act more and more aggressively and more belligerently and irresponsibly, such as the attack on Balakot, now the confrontation in Ladakh with China. This, I think, has been encouraged by the kind of relations, the strategic partnership that the Indians have with the United States at present. So what we need to do, I think, is basically to develop the ability to penetrate Indian ballistic missile defense without necessarily building up and going through the wasteful expenditure of having ballistic missile defenses ourselves. This can be done by effective cruise missiles, MIRV missiles, etc. We also need a sea-based deterrent, particularly for a credible second strike capability. And we also need to develop capabilities in space, particularly ASAT capabilities, because future wars will be fought in space, since the command communication systems are entirely, increasingly now going to be space-based through satellites, etc. So we need to respond to these qualitative changes. Now, let me come to your second point, which is, are there any lessons from the Cold War nuclear competition between the two superpowers relevant to South Asia? Now, in this context, I think the most relevant lesson would be, of course, that Pakistan and India need to engage. We need to be in dialogue to ensure that we are aware, or at least aware, of each other's capabilities, and that we are able to prevent any war by accident or an unintentional act, just as the United States and the Soviet Union did after the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The other thing is that we need to learn the negative lesson that engaging in an arms race, as the United States and the Soviet Union did, developing the capacity to blow each other up many thousand times, is not really relevant and not necessary for Pakistan or India, because we have the capability We just need to make sure that the deterrence is credible. So this is the second lesson, I would say. The third lesson is that we need to realize that we are in a geographically much more dangerous confrontation or situation than the United States and the Soviet Union, because given the distance between these two countries, it would take at least 30 minutes or more for any kind of nuclear attack to be registered or to have an impact on the other side. In the case of India and Pakistan, the time lag is reduced to less than 3 minutes. Number one. Number two, any nuclear use, depending on which way the wind is blowing, is going to have an impact on either country. So no one is going to come out of this looking better or more powerful. This is going to be truly what has been called the Samson option, which is committing mutual suicide. And so this is the third lesson that I think I would underscore that India and Pakistan should take into account. But I must also add that while the measures that we have taken are still in place, which is a good thing, such as the agreement not to attack each other's nuclear facilities. But in the present circumstances, with the current Indian government, the possibility of any kind of dialogue does not seem to be realistic for Pakistan, although I think we are ready for such a dialogue. Coming to the third point, what are the prospects of arms control and CBMs between the global powers that could be relevant for South Asia? Now, here the first thought that comes to my mind is that even in the height of détente between the US and the Soviet Union and then subsequently Russia, this was a binary relationship in the sense that this was a dialogue between two almost more or less equal nuclear weapon states. For us, the situation is somewhat different because at least whereas Pakistan is concerned, our nuclear capability is focused exclusively on India. But the Indians claim that their nuclear capabilities, their strategic capabilities are not Pakistan specific, but that they respond to a bigger threat, and in that they include China. And therefore, it's from their perspective, this is a trilateral problem. Now, if you include the Chinese, it's a quadrilateral problem because the Chinese say that they are not competing with India. They are really ensuring their security against the Soviet Union, against the United States. And we have had, at the track 2 level, some kind of quadrilateral dialogue as well, which didn't get very far. But the fact remains that is the complication. I recall that when I was in New Delhi in our High Commission, at that time in the mid-90s, Pakistan, keeping in view the Indian perspective, had actually put forward a proposal for a 5-nation dialogue, which included Pakistan and India, plus the United States, China, and the Soviet Union / Russia. The US had supported such a forum, and in fact had proposed a wider group, which would have also included the other 2 nuclear weapon states, France and Britain, plus Germany and Japan. However, these proposals didn't get very far. Subsequently, I remember after the nuclear tests, and you know this, Adil, as well, that Pakistan proposed a strategic restraint regime in order to avoid an arms race and in order to prevent any kind of breakdown of communications, etc. But except for the kind of CBMs that were worked out in the Lahore Declaration, no other substantive progress was made. And since then to now, a lot of water has flown down the Jhelum from Srinagar. And so we are in a totally different kind of strategic environment, as I mentioned just before that. So, and then also, I think we should remember that arms control, even between the United States and Russia today, has fallen apart. In the Bush years, the US exited from the ABM treaty. Now, Mr. Trump has left the INF treaty and is not ready to resume dialogue for resumption for renewing the New START agreement. And there are even now, in a last few days, talks about the US considering conducting nuclear tests, which would mean effectively the end of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty as well. So in this environment, even the major powers are moving in a direction that is not helpful. And if these treaties break down, particularly if the CTBT breaks down, then I know for sure, and I'm sure you have also read all this, the Indians are itching to conduct more nuclear tests. And if the Indians test, I'm quite sure that our scientists would also be willing to conduct tests. So that would be the end of the CTBT. So this is what I had to say. If I've left out anything, I'd be happy to answer that in the Q&A. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think very comprehensive overview of the nuclear environment in South Asia. Fortunately or unfortunately, most of things that I intended saying, as these have been addressed already. So I'll try to avoid those duplications as much as possible. But there's always value to giving a different perspective or adding more points, because today's webinar is about to commemorate 22 years of nuclearization, what have we gained and where we are and where we are heading. So in my brief remarks, and thanks to Ambassador Zamir Akram, so I'll try and complete even less than 15 minutes because many things have been already said. I'll focus on three questions: why India, Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons, role of nuclear weapons in Pakistan's security calculus, and the future trajectories. So coming to the first question, why India and Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons? This is a very basic concept or basic thing. And why it is important to understand is because one, the nuclear drivers, the motivations that led both India and Pakistan to build nuclear weapons are also reflected in their nuclear postures and doctrines. So if somebody is able to clearly understand the nuclear drivers, they will be able to understand the future trajectory of nuclear doctrines or postures also. Number two, as Ambassador Zamir Akram also stated about this myth of nuclear triad, I have always been against this. It was never a triad. It has, at best, it can be said as two different dyads between India, China, and India, Pakistan, once we talk about a nuclear process. So if you see, I don't want to go over the history, but it is important to understand because we continue to read and hear that India's main threat is from China. India's primary purpose to build the bomb was China. It was never the case. India started its nuclear program in 1950s. It was a dual track program, both military and civilian application. And by late 1950s, actually in 1958, the father of India's nuclear bomb, Homi J. Bhabha, claimed that India can build a bomb probably in 18 months if the political leadership gives the direction. Whether India had the capacity or not, but it indicates the intent. And this was the time when India-China relations were very cordial. And in our local language, as we say, there used to be a slogan, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. So China was never an existential threat, never a justification to start a nuclear program. It's a post-Cold War phenomena or a perception that has been created that China is a major threat for India and hence India needs to build its nuclear program. I'll just give 2-3 examples to support that. 1964 Chinese test. There was no major concern by India to expedite its nuclear weapons program, although there was an intent or there was a dual track program ongoing in India. And again in 1974, once India tested its nuclear device, China was never cited a major consideration. And to justify that nuclear test, India said it's a peaceful nuclear explosion. So if China was a major consideration or an existential threat from India from the very start, at least the 74 test should have been, the justification for that peaceful nuclear explosion could have been China. In 1998, if we see, again, there was official correspondence letter written to President Clinton that because of the Chinese threat, and probably Pakistan had also conducted one solo missile test of Gori, they built a justification that regional security environment mandated that India conducted a test. But in 95, 96, India tried to conduct tests. It was stopped by US because they picked up, the satellites picked up. So again, China or Pakistan was never a justification. India always wanted to acquire this capability because from the Indian perspective, it is a shortcut to a great power status. And hence we can say that India's nuclear program was always prestige driven and it continues to remain prestige driven. And in the future also, if once we see the trajectory, the Indian Ocean, the acquisition of second strike capability, aircraft carriers and other things, they're all prestige driven. The ICBMs even, they go beyond China. So if China is a major threat, at least the missile ranges should restrict to Chinese mainland, but it goes to other continent. So hence, major powers, all major powers, they have ICBMs and India want to acquire that. So that's the brief history of India's nuclear program. On the other hand, if we see Pakistani side, Pakistan started its nuclear program very reluctantly and in 1975 in actual terms. Reason, we didn't have the resources, we didn't have the technological know-how, but after 71 war and 74 tests, Pakistan had no other option to build a nuclear capability to restore that strategic balance that India was trying to destabilize. So Pakistan's nuclear driver has always been security driven. It is focused on India's threat, a single threat, and that's how our nuclear developments have been. Whatever India does, Pakistan only does as much to counter that threat which is emerging or the intent to destabilize the region. Pakistan only tries to restore that strategic balance. So if you see in the doctrinal or the nuclear posture that Pakistan continues to maintain, we are very clear this capability is against a particular threat emanating from the eastern border. It is for Pakistan's national security. There's nothing about prestige or to achieve a global power ambition or things like that. So it's important because I'm not going to details of the doctrines or postures, but anybody who reads that or who studies that, the students and other scholars who comment, they would understand that why Pakistan reacts to whatever India does, because we feel a certain existential threat from India, and that's the purpose of our nuclear capability. Coming to the second question, that is role of nuclear weapons in Pakistan's security calculus. I'll not go into all the past crises. Ambassador Akram has already cited few of those, but briefly, 86, 87, 1990, these were the crises before Pakistan became overt nuclear weapon state, but there is now reasonable knowledge or literature available that Pakistan had acquired some capability to build a bomb even before 1998, but it didn't test. And in fact, Pakistan was continuously offering proposals to India to keep the region free of nuclear weapons. So that was the intent before 1998. Again, for the same purpose, that Pakistan couldn't afford to get into this nuclear game. But once India tested in 1998, Pakistan had no other option but to demonstrate its capability. So in terms of crisis, 86, 87 brass tacks or 1990 Kashmir uprising, nuclear weapons didn't play any direct role, but the international community knew that both India and Pakistan have some potential, so it attracted international players to come and diffuse the crisis. So we can say that nuclear deterrence played some role or indirect role in diffusing those crises. 99 was a different case. Both India and Pakistan had become overt nuclear weapon state. I'm talking about the Kargil. During that time, Pakistan didn't have operational delivery systems. So in terms, some news reports or some Western reports decide that Pakistan probably mobilized its missiles, but we read in President Musharraf's memoirs also, Pakistan didn't have operational capability in terms of missiles. We had probably some air delivery capability at that time, but in terms of overall nuclear capability, if we say, it was not fully operationalized. So nuclear weapons did play some role, again, attracting international power, but not direct role in diffusing that crisis. 2001 and 2 was the main crisis, or we can see the first classic example of deterrence in South Asia, where India mobilized and the troops stayed there for almost 8 months, but couldn't cross international border or the LOC because Pakistan demonstrated that if India went beyond certain red lines, it might contemplate the use of nuclear weapons also. So we can say that deterrence did work, did prevent India, which is a relatively much bigger country, and prevented a war. 2008, there was no nuclear signaling from either side. India signaled that it can resort to surgical strikes, and Pakistan also responded. It mobilized its air force in a very, very quick time. The operational bases were mobilized, and the message was given, okay, you can do a surgical strike, but in response, Pakistan would do the same thing. And within few hours, the Pakistan Air Force, the forward operational bases were active, and probably if India had conducted a surgical strike, Pakistan definitely would have responded the way it responded in 2019 Balakot crisis. So that's a very clear message that Pakistan has very clear red lines in the conventional field also. Balakot, Ambassador Zamir Akram has already said this about, there was a lot of chatter or narrative coming from the Indian side that Pakistan's nuclear bluff was called. There was no nuclear angle to this crisis. But Indian commentators or the Western scholars, they misinterpret full spectrum deterrence, as very rightly Ambassador Zamir Akram said. And they said, since Pakistan didn't use or employ its tactical nuclear weapon, hence its nuclear bluff has been called, which is totally incorrect, because surgical strikes or firing across the LOC, these are not events which would trigger in the nuclear response from the Pakistani side. And from the Pakistani side, whenever we talk about full spectrum deterrence, we also assert that there are conventional responses to even India's cold start doctrine also. So it doesn't mean that in a future crisis or whenever something happens, Pakistan would immediately resort to nuclear weapons. But taking a cue from the Indian side, if they assume that Pakistan's nuclear bluff was called, whereas it was not, one can also say that China has now called India's nuclear bluff. They detained Indian soldiers, more than 50 soldiers were detained. They captured Indian territory in Ladakh, across the LAC, and India didn't do anything. And here we can see that India's response to Pakistan was entirely different what it has, the way it has responded to China. And that also supports my primary thesis that China is not an existential threat. China and India are not going to go to a major war. They have more than $92 billion of bilateral trade. It is not in their interest. India also knows its limitations. It will not engage in a military conflict. But there's an interesting aspect. Whenever there is a crisis with Pakistan, Indian political leadership exploit it for political, domestic political dividends. And whenever there is a crisis with China, they use that crisis mainly for international diplomacy to give signal to the international players, look, we are standing against China, help us build our military potential. So there are two different trajectories. Pakistan helps them in domestic politics and China helps them in international politics. I'll also briefly talk about economic side of maintaining that nuclear deterrence. There was a recent report by International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. They gave certain figures about defense expenditures or the nuclear weapon spending and maintenance of all the nuclear weapon states. By no means I'm trying to endorse the numbers or whatever it is, but there are certain interesting conclusions that can be drawn from that report. According to that report, Pakistan and India have almost similar kind of nuclear weapons. India is spending $2 billion annually for maintenance and development of its nuclear program, which again is an understatement because India has much more potential. And according to that report, Pakistan is spending around $1 billion annually to maintain its deterrence. So if you see the differential in terms of conventional spending, India is spending $71 billion and Pakistan is spending almost $10 billion in terms of conventional. But by spending or investing in this nuclear capability and spending $1 billion, we are getting much bigger offsets by not competing in conventional arms race. So that's the importance of nuclear deterrence, that you spend less, maintain the credibility of integrity of your nuclear deterrence, and you get more dividends because India is almost 7 times they have in terms of conventional spending. Pakistan cannot afford to get into that arms race, and it should not. And this is where the nuclear capability helps Pakistan to at least maintain or restrict its conventional or the overall military expenditures and divert its resources for socio-economic needs, which in the post-COVID environment are definitely going to be a priority for any government. Now, briefly talking about the future trajectory, because Ambassador Zamir Akram has already talked about second strike capability in the ABM systems and things like that. I'll not repeat those, but I'll briefly talk about the emerging thought in India's strategic enclave. Once I talk about strategic enclave, I talk about their civil and military bureaucracies and the political leadership. There are signals that India might review its no first use posture against Pakistan. That means no first use is that a nuclear state gives a commitment that it will not use nuclear weapons first against another state. But several senior leadership, former defense minister, the current defense minister Rajnath Singh, the former commander of the Strategic Force Command, the National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon, they have all indicated that there is a possibility that India might review its no first use posture and contemplate a preemptive first strike against Pakistan. Now that's a very dangerous thinking in India's nuclear doctrine. Internationally, India continues to sell this argument that India is a responsible country and it maintains no first use posture, but at the operational level or within India's nuclear command authority, because these all people are member of India's nuclear command authority, they are giving signaling. This could be possibly they don't believe themselves in India's no first use posture, or probably there is a thinking ongoing within India's strategic elite to review this no first use posture. So if India does that, and there are indicators also, because India is building hypersonic glide vehicles, we know that it's, for now, they say it will be conventionally armed, but it can be nuclear armed also. But India is also developing capabilities like ABM systems. So there could be a sense of false security amongst India's decision maker, and they might contemplate a preemptive first strike against Pakistan with this false assurance that whatever would be left, they would be able to intercept from the Pakistan. I think that's a very dangerous thing. And that's where we should understand. And one final point, while the international community continues to criticize Pakistan or the development of tactical nuclear weapons and alleges that Pakistan has probably moved to a nuclear war fighting doctrine, which is completely false. Ambassador Akram has already mentioned about full spectrum deterrence, and we can discuss this in question answer session also. These tactical nuclear weapons or short range ballistic missiles that are part of Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence response were primarily aimed to prevent even a limited conflict, military conflict with India. So the primary purpose is to deter the entire spectrum of war. The purpose of this full spectrum is the entire spectrum of threats, starting from tactical, operational to strategic level. These are war prevention weapons. These are not for war fighting. But what India is building now in response to these tactical nuclear weapons is that they are building their own tactical nuclear weapons, Prahar and several others, which the international community has not taken into consideration. And the purpose of India's development of these tactical nuclear weapons is because their doctrine was being discredited after Pakistan's introduction of this full spectrum deterrence and tactical nuclear weapons. So there was a thought that India should have a proportionate response in case Pakistan contemplates the use of its tactical nuclear weapon. So what they are going towards is nuclear war fighting. So Pakistan introduced its short-range ballistic missiles primarily to prevent a conflict. But on the other hand, India's tactical nuclear weapons are being geared to fight a limited nuclear war. So these are two different explanations or understandings. But of course, there is overwhelming focus on Pakistan's nuclear capability, which is mainly political because of the political reasons. So I'll stop here. Since I was the moderator and no one could stop me, so my apologies, I overshot by 3-4 minutes. So next, we have Ms. Sitara Noor. She will educate us on Pakistan's achievement in the field of peaceful applications of nuclear technology, and also cover briefly the measures taken for the safety and security of nuclear material, technology, and facilities. Ms. Noor is a senior research associate at CAS. Previously, she worked at Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation in Austria as a research fellow and at the Pakistan Nuclear Regulatory Authority as an international relations analyst. She was also a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center, Washington, DC, Sandia National Labs, and Monterey Institute for International Studies, US. Ms. Sitara will focus on the following aspects: how nuclear power can help Pakistan meet its energy shortages. Why is it important for Pakistan to join the Nsg, that is Nuclear Suppliers Group, and what are the prospects? Is Pakistan ready to engage in a CBM process with India? Ms. Noor, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. I would actually shift attention from the previous discussion that has taken place at this forum. And as you rightly shared earlier, that Pakistan nuclear program remains under international focus and global scrutiny, as well as the global security. And as a default, its civilian nuclear program had been underappreciated and less recognized, which is otherwise very comprehensively developed and adding to the national development. So my discussion will focus on 3 main areas. First, development of Pakistan's peaceful nuclear program, looking at its nuclear safety and security regime that's very comprehensive and globally appreciated, and followed by briefly talking about on Nsg Debate and CBM process with India. So looking at Pakistan's nuclear program and its development, Pakistan was a direct beneficiary of Atom for Peace program of the United States in 1950s, unlike India, whose nuclear development predates its creation. It was in 1955 that government of Pakistan established a 12-member committee of scientists for promoting peaceful applications of nuclear science and technology. Pakistan Atomic Energy Ordinance was promulgated in 1965 on 27 May to be precise. And according to the ordinance, the function of the commission shall be to do all the acts and things, including research work necessary for the promotion of peaceful uses. So Pakistan's nuclear program primarily was for peaceful application. With a long-standing professionalism in this area, Pakistan has developed strong credentials with respect to the IAEA safeguard implementation at its facilities, the presence of a robust regulatory mechanism, and a commitment to pursuing and expanding its civilian nuclear program to not only to meet its energy need, but also which also adds to its socioeconomic development. So talking about the areas Pakistan is using nuclear technology, its applications are being used in diverse areas of electricity generation, health, agricultural, hydrology, industry, environment, and basic sciences. Nuclear program that started in 1965, as I stated earlier, was primarily focusing on not only the nuclear application in health and agriculture, but also generating energy. So currently, Pakistan has 5 operational civilian nuclear power plants, which are generating about 1430 megawatt, which is 5.7 to total energy generation. Goal is to expand 40,000 megawatt as envisaged in National Nuclear Energy Vision 2050. So apart from the nuclear energy used for development of nuclear energy, Pakistan is using nuclear application for the achievement of 9 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals with the support of the IAEA. And all these areas, civilian application, are helping in Pakistan in 9 of those Sustainable Development Goals. For instance, zero hunger, good health, clean water, affordable and clean energy, and industry, climate action, and a few others. So PAC is pursuing research and development broadly in following area, which includes basic applied sciences, food, agriculture and biotechnology, human health, energy, and industry. And with regards to research and development, PAC has established a network of institutions which are imparting education, led by Pakistan Institute of Nuclear Science and Technology, PINSTEC, which is the primary source of Pakistan's human resource in its nuclear program and nuclear development. And in agriculture, as well as biology, agriculture in Karachi and Faisalabad and Peshawar as well. In the health sector, there are a number of developments that Pakistan has taken up. Pakistan's National Cancer Research Center, Cancer Registry and Program of Action for Cancer Therapy. These are some of the areas which are exponentially helping not only in cancer research, but also treatment. And currently there are 18 medical centers focusing on cancer treatment, which are established under the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, and 2 more are under constructions. And these hospitals serve nearly 1 million patients each year by using nuclear applications. And moving forward to, as I stated earlier, Pakistan's nuclear weapons program remained under focus, and broadly Pakistan's civilian as well as the nuclear weapon program had remained under scrutiny because of the perceived nuclear security risks. And the safety risk as well as the safety risk. So the second part of my discussion would focus on what those nuclear security risks are, as well as safety, and what action Pakistan has taken with regards to address those threats or perceived threats. So broadly speaking, Pakistan's perceived nuclear security threats abroad had been internal instability and risk of state failure, nuclear weapons or materials falling into wrong hands, and loss of control or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. As well as there were a number of concerns, internationally shared a number of concerns with regards to what Pakistan's nuclear safety applications are. So let's take a look at the evolution of nuclear safety and security regime in Pakistan, which is strongly embedded in the legislative and institutional structure. Starting in 1964, as Pakistan embarked upon its nuclear program, Pakistan Nuclear Safety Commission came into being. And Pakistan's Safety and Radiation Protection Ordinance was passed in 1984, leading to Nuclear Regulatory Board in 1994, which finally culminated into the development of Pakistan Nuclear Regulatory Authority in 2001. They are not only looking at the safety aspect, but also the security aspects, and to help that or to further institutionalize that, National Command Authority Act came into being in 2010. And to look at the export control area, Strategic Export Control Division was established in 2004. Apart from these legislative and institutional structure, there are national security systems that have been established in Pakistan to deal with any security or safety threat that might emerge. There is a security division under SPD that is primarily assigned the task of securing Pakistan's nuclear assets, be it in the civilian domain as well as or the weapon side. There is a physical protection and security directorate working under PNRA, which is specifically looking at various aspects of nuclear safety, nuclear security in the civilian domain, from securing orphan radioactive sources to covering the border security, to ensure that no nuclear material comes into country without being detected, as well as ensuring physical security of all nuclear assets across the country. Pakistan has also established Center of Excellence for Nuclear Security, which comprises of a training academy at Chakri, National Institute for Nuclear Safety and Security at PNRA, and Pakistan Institute for Engineering and Applied Sciences. PSENS has an international stature and has conducted various IAE courses with participants over 45 countries on various aspects of nuclear safety and security. There are a number of additional systems that Pakistan has established with regards to controlling or mitigating any nuclear emergency related situation. Pakistan is well prepared, and in close coordination with IAEA, there are a number of systems that has been established. And Pakistan is fulfilling not only for its domestic needs, not only to serve its national requirements, but also to international obligations. There are a number of international conventions that Pakistan is part of in safety and security. There are UNSC resolutions and IAEA resolutions that Pakistan definitely looks into to comply with. In the third part, I would quickly talk about the Nsg debate briefly. I would just touch upon these areas briefly so that we have ample time for discussion. And I just throw certain ideas and that could be actually covered and discussed during the question and answers. The Nsg is primarily was created in response to India's nuclear test in 1974. The purpose of this organization at that time was to stop further proliferation by regulating international nuclear trade. But what it has done is that while it has, it's ironical rather that India got waiver without fulfilling any specific criteria enlisted in the Nsg because of the other political reasons, whereas Pakistan having meeting almost more and equal or more criteria is unable to become part, and which hinders its civilian nuclear program exponentially. So that's Pakistan's approach had been at various international forums that Nsg should establish a robust criteria-based approach for non-NPT states. And if their standards are met, they should, on certain criteria, they should be made part of the Nsg so that it does not hinder the civilian developments of any country, unlike the political approaches that have been done to favor India's participation in it. Quickly touching upon some of the nuclear CBMs, as that was also part of the question that was being asked initially. Again, I would just briefly talk about some of the CBM process that has taken place. But before that, I think it is important to understand that CBMs or the nuclear CBMs, nuclear confidence building measures, are means towards an end and not end in itself. They are just a process to develop certain confidence over which some concrete agreements, some concrete understandings between the states, particularly in this case, India and Pakistan, could have developed. But unfortunately, that means between India and Pakistan had remained just means, and they did not lead to any concrete development or follow-up discussions that would actually help resolve the primary issues between the two states. So Pakistan, like in conventional side, Pakistan and India have had a number of nuclear CBMs, which include early notification of missile test and non-attack agreement. And these two particularly are the CBMs that have withstood the pressure of time, withstood the pressure of various crises that had taken place. And both countries had almost religiously abided by these two CBMs. But the question arises that while they are important, it is important, also equally important, to build upon those CBMs and make them more updated. But unfortunately, there is no appetite on Indian side to actually enhance or expand those that CBM process. Regardless that, not considering the fact that Pakistan had put on table a list of nuclear safety and security related confidence building measures. And Pakistan had also requested India to develop their unilateral moratorium of non-testing into a bilateral moratorium. But that again had not met any reception on Indian side, because probably India is not willing to engage, and as rightly highlighted by the previous speakers, that apparently there is no expectation that there would be any positive engagement as long as the current regime or the current line of action that India is taking right now is continuing. So what are the future prospects, and how Pakistan should actually look at cumulatively to enhance not only its international image as a peaceful, as a responsible nuclear state that not only has weapons, but also has a very, very comprehensive and unfortunately underappreciated nuclear, civilian nuclear program. So first and foremost, it is important that we must promote and talk about Pakistan's achievements in civilian domain to get out of that negative spotlight. As I've stated and emphasized earlier, that while nuclear developments or the nuclear aspect remains under focus, there are a number of developments that Pakistan has achieved in the civilian side, and they are widely recognized in the IAEA sector and the countries who are actually collaborating with Pakistan on that aspect. So that needs to be talked about more and promoted more. And Pakistan should enhance supply capacity and indigenize and commercialize technology. while it is important to focus and keep attempting on becoming part of the NSG through a criteria-based approach, side by side Pakistan should work on indigenizing their capability to increase their nuclear weapons, the civilian nuclear aspects, because one way or the other, their hindrances would continue to come. Pakistan must solve funding issue, because we talk about having civilian nuclear energy deals with other countries, but there is funding issue that always hinders. I mean, there are political hindrances, but if such an idea materializes, there would be funding issues. So we must continue on that. And of course, discrimination against Pakistan by the Western powers, we must continue to work and project our capability in that domain so that those discriminations can be undercut. Side by side, we must continue to work on self-sufficiency, as I emphasized earlier, and expanding cooperation with China, because that's where our most collaboration comes from and happens. On the NSG front, we must continue Pakistan continue its effort in gaining equitable and non-discriminatory access for the international civilian nuclear cooperation. And Nsg Debate is currently not on the forefront, but at back end, I think there are diplomatic efforts that must continue regardless of if it is in focus or not. On this, there are some specific action that Pakistan take, and I'm happy to talk about them in more detail if there are some questions, which include upgradation of safety and security measures. Because as I said, Pakistan enjoys a very good reputation in the safety and security measures that it has taken already. But I think it's important we continue to collaborate with the IAEA to ensure that that good reputation is continuously maintained. Likewise, we should continue close cooperation and collaboration with the IAEA, and not only remain limited to that area that we have traditionally been working, because IAEA's work is expanding exponentially in different areas. So we must be forward-looking and forward-looking in our connection with the IAEA, establish better connection. Information sharing would actually remain very, very important, because if we look at some of the negative spotlight, that comes primarily because we at times shy away because of multiple concerns that we may have, the state may have at different times. But information sharing is very, very important, because we don't want much attention to be given to our nuclear weapons program. We shy away from sharing some of the information on the civilian side as well. For this purpose, I think it would be important to clearly delineate civilian setup from the military. While Pakistan has done a lot already in that regard, and we claim that we have delineated civilian and military setups, but in order to become more active on the civilian side, probably more effort needs to be done in that area. I thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Adil, can I add something?
Sir, in the same context, or there's something else?
Yeah,
because the number of
I just want to, just in the same context, very small point, just to add to what has been presented in an excellent presentation by Ms. Noor. And that is about Pakistan's cooperation with CERN, the Center for the European Center for Nuclear Research. You know, in 2015, Pakistan became the only non-European country, the first non-European country to become a member of an associate member of CERN. And before that, Pakistani nuclear scientists and technicians and engineers had been closely associated with various programs at CERN, including the setting up of the Large Hadron Collider that exists over there. And some of our nuclear scientists like Dr. Abdul Salam and so many others have been honored by this the institution. And even today, the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission is a close partner of CERN in various programs in Geneva as well as in other parts of the world, like in Jordan on the Sesame program. So that is a fill-up to the civilian side of our nuclear capabilities, which also needs to be given the right kind of projection.
Sir, thank you very much. I think those were very useful comments to build on what Ms. Noor was saying. We have a number of questions, and we have time around 40 minutes or so. And what I'll do is I'll try to wrap those questions so that we can answer as many as possible. So a set of questions. First, I think I'll request Ambassador Zamir Akram to address this question by Ambassador Jelani. How do we propose to maintain strategic balance in the face of S-400 missile defense systems acquired by India, when S-400 boasts of multiple layered defense protection against incoming missiles, including cruise and ballistic missiles, as well as MIRV technology? Is there a credible study to show that MIRV can blunt S-400? Secondly, do we have a mechanism to determine if a missile launched by adversary is a nuclear or a conventional missile before it hits the target? So this is a question. While you think about it, I'll allot one question to myself that's on full spectrum deterrence. So, but I'll address that question in the end. Second question that I want to bring out for President Cass, if he wants to. This is a question because this area relates directly to Cass' interests. This is by Mr. Ali Jaber Malik, who is from APP. He says the Pakistan preparedness and response against India has always gave Pakistan an edge over India due to its efficiency and proficiency in war domain. The Indian dominance in space war medium is creating a sort of strategic disbalance. Will Pakistan's least attention on its space program weaken its nuclear might before India? So that's a question for President Cass, if he wishes to address that. On Ms. Sitara's, I think she wrote a very interesting article today, which appeared in one of the leading newspapers on ongoing India-China tensions. So I know your expertise is not only peaceful application, you have been working on deterrence issues also. So if you want to comment on those tensions from a nuclear angle, I have said some things, but if you want to add those. And finally, I'll talk about something about full spectrum deterrence. Ambassador Akram, sir.
Okay, so my friend Ambassador Jelani has asked a difficult question. And it's difficult because fortunately, there is no practical experience that exists to answer this, because no one has actually used anti-ballistic missile systems. No one has tried to penetrate them. And had they done so, we would have had some kind of data on whether or not what would be the outcome. So what I'm going to say is based simply on conjecture, on guesstimates. And the first point about the S-400, Russian S-400 ballistic missile defense system that India has acquired from Russia, whether that would destabilize. Yes, I think the short answer is yes, it would destabilize because at least in my view, ballistic missile defense systems or ABM systems are inherently destabilizing, because stability is based on the mutual perception of vulnerability. That was the rationale of the argument originally made for the ABM treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, that both sides voluntarily accepted that they would remain vulnerable to each other, and therefore the deterrence between them would remain credible. The Americans then have knocked out that argument by developing, their ballistic missile capabilities, and then the Russians have responded. So in the Indo-Pakistan context as well, this should have remained a part of our strategic equation. And in fact, if you look at the strategic restraint regime that we presented to the Indians after the test in '98, this is one aspect that both sides would eschew, would not develop ballistic missile defenses. But now Indians have worked on this, and so the question is that, is it destabilizing? Yes, of course it's destabilizing. How do we manage to deal with it. I think, again, this is in the area of conjecture because no one has tried in a real-time situation to do this. But the argument is, or at least the estimation is, that the radars of the S-400 do not provide 100% cover. And there are various gaps in that cover. So if you have the right kind of cruise missiles, which we have tested and we are continuing to develop those tests, then it is possible to hit and penetrate that kind of system. The second is that even if India doubled its number of BMD systems, in our assessment, there are still a lot of Indian targets which will remain vulnerable to a Pakistani nuclear missile attack. So even they cannot cover the whole landmass of the Indians. Even the United States can't do that to itself. So there is always a window of vulnerability that will exist that can be exploited. Number three, MIRVs. Yes, MIRVs, because they can carry multiple warheads, the S-400 or any ballistic missile defense system cannot 100% guarantee that it will be able to take out all the incoming ballistic warhead, the MIRV warheads from the other side. So there is always a big question mark and always a large room for error. So I think that is the purpose of our own development of developing both cruise missiles and MIRV missiles, plus our ability to use decoys, chaff. The radars then pick up a lot of signals of incoming projectiles, and it's confused. It doesn't know whether this is a warhead or whether this is a dud or a dummy. So that again is another tactic that can be employed and we are in the process of doing something like this. The third point of his question, if I remember correctly, is how do we know whether the warhead on an incoming missile is nuclear or conventional? Again, the short answer is we don't. And that's what makes it very, very dangerous. Because if there is an incoming missile, if a side launches a missile, and remember what I said in my earlier presentation, that our reaction time is very short. It's less than 3 minutes. So, there is this thing about this saying that the Americans used to use them or lose them. So at the moment you hear, or moment you know that there is a signal, then you launch on warning. And because you don't know whether the warhead being carried is conventional or nuclear, it makes it much more difficult. I would say the only qualification I would put is that for any country, even for the major powers, to launch a missile with nuclear warheads is a huge, big step. And everyone, I think, will be sensible enough to realize that kind of step should not be taken. So we should assume that a responsible state, even if it launches a ballistic missile, will not be using nuclear warheads. But it depends entirely on the situation. And that is something which is a big question mark, and we really can't say for sure.
So thank you very much. Ms. Sitara, your question on China, India tensions, and is there a nuclear angle to this? And I'll request if you can keep your remarks brief, because we have more than 19 questions and
Yes.
comments or the chat section. So we want to give maximum time to the other guests also.
Yes, definitely. I'll be very brief and quick. Regarding India-China standoff, I personally believe that there is no nuclear angle, primarily because there is interdependence. There is so much interdependence on the economic side and the conventional deterrence that exists already between India and China, that the nuclear angle does not come largely in picture. I mean, in the hindsight, in the background, of course, that fear exists, but I think it's the conventional deterrence that plays larger role. And also we must keep in mind no matter how flawed or how unbelievable their NFU may be, India's NFU may be, but I think that no first use policy between India and China, both having kind of pushes that nuclear angle little more behind. So in my view, in the current standoff, I don't see any nuclear angle coming into play. And quickly coming to Saima's question with regards to safety upgrades following the Fukushima accident. I think this is very important that Pakistan has to keep in mind that Pakistan has always taken steps with regards to whatever the international practices are. And Pakistan did a comprehensive safety review of all its nuclear facilities in view of the lessons learned from Fukushima, and all new requirements, safety requirements issued by the IAEA were incorporated in all its facilities, existing as well as the new one. And the new facilities, especially K2 and K3, they had incorporated all passive security measures, because this was one of safety measures, sorry. This was one of the issue that was noted in the Fukushima aspect. So the K2 and K3 do have the passive safety measures that would be helpful in mitigating any nuclear safety related issue that might arise in future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This was a classic case of preemptive response, because I didn't put Saima's question to you. It was intended to be in the second round. So anyway, thank you. So since we are talking all nuclear, so preemptive response or preemptive strike.
Yeah,
So
I just saw
I'll request President Kass, if he wishes to address this question by Mr. Ali Jabir Malik on the neglect on the space side, and can it weaken Pakistan's nuclear rights? So if you want to address this question.
Yes, I think yes, this question has come up every time that we have had a conference, and every time the answer has been that the space has been neglected, although both the programs started about at the same time, but the nuclear program reached its fruition stage and the space got nowhere. It was because of obviously lack of attention and lack of resources that were devoted to the space program. And now that everything is coming together in the space, that is cyber is getting together, computer technologies, communication is getting together. So electronic warfare is getting together. So now I think there is realization that we need to focus on this. But I guess in the present circumstances, the problem would be finding the resources, especially after COVID. The economic situation is very bad. But there is no denying that there was not enough focus in the past on our space program. That is why we have lagged behind.
Sir, thank you very much for your comments. Okay, the question that I chose for myself was about full spectrum deterrence and the credible minimum deterrence, because there were a number of questions. And since we have been dealing with these issues for quite a long time, there are several misperceptions about this concept, about the full spectrum deterrence. Full spectrum deterrence, this terminology was coined in 2011 and made public in 2013 for the first time by National Command Authority statement. It was after India introduced its Cold Start doctrine, and India indicated that it can possibly find a space for a limited military conflict below Pakistan's perceived nuclear strategic threshold. So that was the thinking on the Indian side. So what Pakistan did was that while it had strategic capability, it also introduced strategic capability, means the medium and long range nuclear capable missiles for deterrence of the major war. It also introduce short-range ballistic missiles, tactical nuclear weapons, as some people say. So the message was that there is no space for even a limited war between two nuclear powers. So the intent was to cover the entire spectrum of threats, ranging from tactical, operational to strategic, as Ambassador Zamir Akram and myself have previously stated in our comments. So this was the intent. Many people mistook it as a possible shift from credible minimum deterrence to a full spectrum deterrence. Full spectrum deterrence is within the ambit of credible minimum deterrence. This is not a quantitative shift. This is a qualitative response to the nature of threat that came in Pakistan's space, and Pakistan was forced to respond. So many people think probably we are building capabilities endlessly, and that's where we are going, that full spectrum of capabilities or missiles that we are going. It has never been the case. If you see successive NCA statements, we are very categorically stated, we have stated in the past also, the last one also, that full spectrum is within the ambit of credible minimum deterrence. Pakistan cannot afford to get into arms race. It has no intent on competing in numbers, and in nuclear, numbers do not matter. If you are capable of inflicting sufficient or unacceptable damage to the adversary, that's good enough. And that's what the principal purpose of this doctrine or Pakistan nuclear posture has been. So I think we should understand this, the concept. It is not a different concept. In the same context, once Balakot strikes happened, many people said the full spectrum meant all conflict. It was never said like this. So that tactical kind of operations, those were in the form of brigade level or integrated battle groups that were part of India's Cold Start doctrine. So in that case, this full spectrum deterrence was introduced. It was not about there would be a surgical strike and Pakistan would resort to nuclear signaling. No, that was never the case. Surgical strike is entirely a different thing. And Pakistan has always been saying that whenever the crisis will happen or there is a military escalation, there would be conventional responses to whatever India does. And if those conventional responses are not good enough, only then the nuclear capability would come in to give a message that Pakistan will not let it go like this. So Balakot was one example in which India tested Pakistan's resolve by conducting so-called surgical strike, and Pakistan responded the way it had planned earlier, and we all see the results also. So nobody should assume that whenever there would be a crisis between the full spectrum deterrence posture should kick in. This is entirely a wrong concept. But we can go on to this. Next, I'll go to second round of questions. First is by our colleague, Director Air Marshal Ishfaq. He is asked, how do you view the security of Indian nuclear weapons as well as efficacy of the Indian nuclear command and control under the leadership of warmongering, hardline Hindutva proponents who have demonstrated their irrationality in their decision-making in the past few years? So maybe Sitara, you can take this question. Second question, sorry, my apologies. Second question is from Dr. Bilal from Nottingham, United Kingdom. He says, do the worthy panels envisage not too distant future where the advances in directed energy weaponry can erode the deterrence value of existing nuclear delivery mechanisms? If so, then will Pakistan have the luxury of the West looking the other way as they did during the Cold War? So this is second question. Third is about CTBT. There are a number of questions about CTBT. So I'll just add some thoughts to it in the later part, because this recent debate, as Ambassador Akram also said, the debate generated by Washington Post article that United States is probably contemplating testing a nuclear, resuming nuclear tests. So which country is most likely to benefit from this resumption of nuclear testing, and whether our adversary India, which is building ICBMs, it will test its thermonuclear weapons or not, because without thermonuclear weapons, ICBMs, I think, do not matter much. So Sitara, starting from your end, President Kaisar, whenever you want to intervene, you have the floor, sir. Sitara?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Adil. Thank you for the question, Mr. Ishfaq also. India's command and control under Hindutva regime, I think this is something Pakistan and the rest of the world should be very, very worried about and should definitely pay most attention to. Because if we recall, not long time ago, Pakistan was under so much international pressure that while I was discussing the perceived nuclear risks in Pakistan, this was one of the primary risks that international community showed vis-a-vis Pakistan, that extremists would take over 70 kilometers away. There are Taliban sitting in Pakistan, but I think those things, none of those things actually materialized, but all those fears are actually happening in India, where the leadership itself is not only propagating the extremist ideology, but also threatening. I mean, we must have some confidence in the institutional structure of India. But I think the way they had responded during the Balakot Pulwama crisis, the way they had started signaling nuclear angle from the very initiation of the crisis, this is something really worrisome. And not only Pakistan, but the international, it's about time that international community must pay sufficient attention to that aspect.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Akram, sir, would you like to deal with this question of CTBT? I know that you have already addressed, but there are a number of questions about CTBT. Will India resume nuclear testing in case United States does, and whether it will go for thermonuclear test or not?
Okay, so let us recall that in May 1998, when the Indians tested, the evaluation of their tests at the international level were not very complimentary. Of the first 3 tests that were conducted on 11 May, one was about 12 to 15 kilotons, which was successful. The second apparently fizzled out because no seismic soundings were emitted or taken. And the third, which was supposed to be a fusion test, in other words, a hydrogen bomb test. Apparently, if it was, then it did not go off because apparently the second explosion or the secondary explosion, which would have set off the hydrogen bomb, did not happen. So there is a lot of big question mark about whether they were able to test. The other 2 tests were according to the Indians themselves, were sub-kiloton tests. So were they testing a small nuclear warhead or not? Because all they said was that it generated data and whatnot, so it was useful for their scientists, etc. So keeping that in view, if the CTBT collapses, then India, which is under a unilateral moratorium for not testing, could seriously decide that it wanted to test as well. We know that in southern India, there is a nuclear facility which has been working on highly enriched uranium in quantities which the Indians claim that is producing HEU for their nuclear powered submarine fleet, but they only have 2 nuclear powered submarines. One of them doesn't work. So the amount of HEU being produced is far in excess of what they need for these nuclear powered submarines. So the conclusion that has been drawn by a lot of people, not just by Pakistan, but a number of others, that they are actually producing high quantities of HEU for a thermonuclear bomb. And if they are actually trying to develop a thermonuclear bomb, they may well test. Then I would also refer people to read 1 or 2 articles written by George Perkovich, who has been an authority on the Indian program, who wrote after the Nsg waiver that was given, that one of the things that India would do is that it would accumulate sufficiently high quantities of fissile material through imports from abroad and build up a critical stockpile, following which it would conduct its own tests. And if they were, as a result of that, expelled or challenged by the international community, they would basically withdraw their unilateral commitment to the CTBT. So if this happens, yes, I think the Indians will test. And if I were a Pakistani scientist, I would want to test too. Definitely, I mean, a scientist, for the nuclear scientist, definitely more data is always more essential. So yeah, I think this is how the situation is. But the bottom line, I think at the moment, it all depends on what the US does.
Thank you. Thank you. Just my apologies. I also posed this question, shared this question by Dr. Bilal Shahid from Nottingham, UK. This was about directed energy weaponry. Yeah. So
okay. So, I mean, we are now at a point where there are the technological developments that are taking place are creating a totally new environment in which strategic stability and deterrence would have to be established or ensured. Directed energy weapons, lasers, whatever, are one of those kind of things that are under development. Artificial intelligence is now clearly a part of the strategic arsenal of the major powers. And then there is cyber warfare. And cyber warfare is such that because we are all now increasingly online, in fact, all our systems are controlled or in some way involve computers and electronics in the system, a kind of virus that is introduced into the system by your opponent, and one may not even detect it. And we know that the Americans have tried to do this with the Iranian program, the Stuxnet virus that was introduced. And they've also tried to do this with the North Korean missile tests, which they claim set back the North Korean missile program for a long time. So this technology has been used. Unfortunately, the strategic communities, whether in the US or in Russia or China or Pakistan or India, have not yet been able to come up with how we are going to respond. I think the first step for us in Pakistan is to insulate our systems by, for instance, insulating our communication systems, command and control systems, etc. And I know that we have done that in many ways by changing the SOPs for communications, etc. But the threat is multiple, as I just mentioned, the different ways this can happen. And we need to find ways of how to deal with it. The thing that comes into my mind is basically go low tech instead of going high tech. If you go low tech, you know, when I was in the Foreign Office, when we had to send an extremely sensitive secret communication, we sent it written by hand and delivered by hand. We didn't trust any kind of electronic, even in those days. So I think the answer would be to go low tech as far as we can and prevent these kind of, but that's not a solution for the long term. We have to come up with, the other is, of course, developing countervailing capability. And that's obvious, because if your opponent has the capability and we don't have the capability, there will be a tendency to take the risk by the opponent to use the capability. Just as I was mentioning in space, as long as we don't test our own anti-satellite capability, the Indians have us at a disadvantage because they can knock out our communication satellites anytime they want. And that with that, we are blind. And so unless we have a deterrent to knock out the Indians, then we would have deterrence. So this is a game of cat and mouse that will continue to go on.
So thank you very much. There was another part to this question on full spectrum deterrence that I forgot to address, because there's also a perception that full spectrum deterrence means by announcing that we have short range and the strategic range weapons. So Pakistan probably is thinking for kind of escalation letter, which some people would say graduated response. I haven't read any literature and I haven't heard any statement where Pakistan would say this thing that we would start from the minimum and go to the maximum. It was never the case. The full spectrum was that in case there is a threat of a major war, the strategic weapons are there. But if your adversary is coming with kind of integrated battle groups as part of its Gold Star doctrine, we have a response for that also. So that's my understanding. And again, question about quid pro quo plus. In simple terms, this terminology in the I think decision-making circles was prevalent, but for the first time recently, General Kidwai used this terminology as quid pro quo plus. In simple terms, Pakistan's response will be with a premium. So that's the message to India. Whatever India will do, Pakistan's conventional response will come with a premium. So that's a quid pro quo plus, I think. So we move on to another round where Mr. Aziz is asked about the prospects of intermediate nuclear force treaty. It's related to major powers rivalry, and we all know that United States want China to be integrated into this kind of a trilateral arms control competition. But Ambassador Akram, as you know, there were some people thinking about bringing in or roping in India and Pakistan also into the INF treaty, whereas INF only bans 500 to certain range of 5,500 kilometers of missiles. This was a debate generated, and of course it doesn't suit our interests because all our missiles of this range, and if you were ever to be part of the INF, so means you giving up all your missile inventory. But since this question has been asked by a participant, so I'll request you to respond. And the second, Ms. Sitara, you have talked about NSG. The question by Ms. Anika is, are there prospects for India to get into the NSG? Ambassador Akram, first you, sir.
Okay, so I think the argument that is being made by the Trump administration that the INF treaty must also include first and foremost China, because a lot of the Chinese missile inventory falls within that range. And then some have even talked about India and Pakistan. I think this is a false and it's a false argument meant to distract and divert attention from the real issue, which is that the Americans are not comfortable with the INF treaty and that they want to develop their own and they want to walk out of it, develop their own capabilities. And because they've also been accusing the Russians of violating this treaty. So I think that's the real purpose. I also think that the Americans know as well as anyone else that the Chinese are not going to agree to become a part of any trilateral arrangement on INF, let alone India and Pakistan. Because as you said, for India and Pakistan, that's the real nature of our missile capabilities. And we are not about to hand them out for the sake of this INF treaty between the US and Russia. So I think the possibility of any of this kind of happening outside the bilateral US-Russian equation is not possible at all.
Ms. Sitara, on the NSG question, please.
Yes, on the NSG, apart from Anika's question on India's prospects of making it to NSG, there is a related question from Ms. Adila as well, how many countries supporting India and Pakistan for that matter. I think situation at the NSG is evolving as since the debate started, and I think it is at a kind of stalemate now, where I think Pakistan's primary support comes from China as well as from Turkey, who are supporting Pakistan's stance of having a criteria-based approach. Some countries in privately have also supported Pakistan's stance, but what actually matters is how many show up for the voting. So as long as Pakistan retains its support from China as well as from Turkey, or at least one country's support, I think India's prospect of becoming a member would be limited to none. And Pakistan should continue to work for the development of a criteria-based approach, where country not only on the political conditions, but on a criteria where they meet certain requirements of a nuclear supplies group. A certain criteria should be established for the non-NPT member states, which can actually enable them to become part. So yeah, I mean, of course, developments can take place in future, but Pakistan and India in the back end are continuously working for their own benefit. That's I would want to add.
Thank you very much. I'll just add on to the Nsg debate, since I was personally involved once I was working in the government. I no longer work in the government, so I don't speak on behalf of any government institution at the moment. But on the Nsg, we have to take into consideration that nuclear suppliers group is an informal arrangement. It's not a legal regime or legal treaty. Yeah. So why India is so much interested in getting into the Nsg once it has already been granted an exemption from the nuclear suppliers group export control guidelines in 2008 by the Nsg group. And India can trade, get into nuclear trade with all the Nsg members. So the primary purpose of India is this diplomatic push, and they invested so much that all the successive US administrations, they were kind of pleading India's case that India should be brought into the Nsg because India is so-called a responsible country. So this is irony, this is all politics. As we also discussed earlier also, the Nsg came into existence after India's misuse of peaceful nuclear technology for weapons purposes, and then the London Group came in and the Nsg was created to prevent future such action. And after so many years, now the same group was in a way trying to bring India inside it. So it is not only China or Turkey which were opposed to India. There are several European countries who joined Nsg based on the principles, on non-proliferation principles, that we need to stop this proliferation of nuclear technology or misuse of civilian technology for peaceful purposes. So there are a number of countries. Once we launched this initiative and we reached out to countries, especially the European countries who are part of the Nsg, they feel cheated because they say that we signed the NPT and we adhere to all non-proliferation norms, and we were told not to build weapons, and still even the peaceful nuclear technology is regulated. Some are denied on political reason, whereas this is a country which misuse civil technology for military purpose. And for this country, we made this arrangement, and now you have granted this country an exemption also, and now you want to bring it into the Nsg because Nsg works on a consensus. So once India would be part of the Nsg, so it will have a veto power on all the decision making that goes on with the Nsg. So this is the irony. People talk about mainly the United States. They built an argument that India is a big country, big market, big nuclear market, so we need to bring India inside. It will help non-proliferation credentials. Pakistan's position had been, okay, if it helps a non-NPT state, if it helps to bring a non-NPT state into the Nsg, why not to bring all the non-NPT states into the Nsg? So make a criteria which is non-discriminatory, and it helps the global non-proliferation norms also, and it will help universalize the non-proliferation regime also, which interestingly was the title of my first book that I wrote once I was at King's College, Universalizing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Norms. And here in that book, I have discussed this idea how non-NPT states can be integrated into mainstream non-proliferation regime, but the criteria has to be objective, based on principle, not discriminatory criteria. Now, last round of questions. I think we should move on to. There's a question by our young researchers. Let me give them an opportunity also, because they take lots of interest. By Omar Ahmed, how can Pakistan and China collaborate to counter India's manipulation of high politics or in international domain? So that's a basic question. And from Maheen, can you please elaborate on influence of China in South Asian nuclear dynamics, given that India is rapidly advancing its nuclear capabilities with the US help? Will that US-India succeed in exerting global diplomatic pressure on China, as this is what Indian military is suggesting as a solution, also keeping US-China rivalry during the prior to the virus in view? Mr. Tara, can you take this second question? And I'll request Ambassador Zamir Akram to take Omar Ahmed's question. And then I'll briefly talk about, again, there was a question by Shiza Arif about no first use, and then we will close, and I'll request President Kass to make his concluding remarks there. Mr. Tara.
Sir, can you please go first? I was actually reading the question and I just...
Okay. So this is a question by Ms. Maheen Shafiq.
Yeah.
Can you please elaborate on influence of China in South Asian nuclear dynamics, given that India is rapidly advancing its nuclear capabilities with the US help? Will the US-India succeed in exerting global diplomatic pressure on China, as this is what India, it's about new Cold War emerging. So there have been strong statements by China also advising India not to get involved between two big brothers. So that's the question probably if you want to address, because you just recently wrote on this issue.
Yes. I just actually lost track of the question. I was reading Maheen's question. I'm
Maybe
sorry.
Ambassador Zamir Akram, sir.
Yes, please, sir. If you can please go ahead first.
Take a
I'll
lead
just
on this?
take.
About
I just lost the text of the question. Sorry.
Pakistan, China, can they collaborate to neutralize India's, or if there is a need for China and Pakistan to collaborate to neutralize India's growing influence or interventions in regional politics?
You asking me?
Sir.
Okay, so I think that yes, Pakistan and China are already close partners, and especially after the growing competition between the United States and China, this Pakistan-China relationship has assumed even greater importance. Let us step back a bit and say and recall that around about 2008, 2009, when China emerged as the second largest world economy, replacing Japan, and in some ways it overtook even the United States in some sectors, even the United States, especially in technology and other areas. The US has been, and while at the same time the US was embroiled in two major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have been a great drain on their economy, apart from the economic collapse that took place in 2008. So since that time, the US has tried to pursue a policy whereby they want to contain China. And they want to contain it through alliances with existing strategic partners or new strategic partners. These include Japan, Australia, and new partners such as India, Vietnam. And now we have this thing called the Quadrilateral Alliance, which includes the US, India, Australia, and Japan, which is a alliance which ostensibly is meant to keep the freedom of navigation, to ensure freedom of navigation in the so-called Indo-Pacific region. And in reality, it is meant to contain China and to contest its claims, or its what China sees as its rightful sovereignty over places such as the South China Sea or the East China Sea, as well as now as we are seeing it unfold in the borders with India, particularly in Ladakh. So in this environment, the Chinese responded by coming up with their Belt and Road Initiative, which is a strategic objective to create a backup or a fallback option, whereby if their sea lanes are choked, if they are denied sea access by this Quadrilateral Alliance, then China will at least have a fallback land route to the rest of the world, starting with Pakistan, where CPEC is the sort of flagship project. Now, you know that CPEC has been opposed by India and as by the United States. The United States has also launched a major offensive saying that China's loans, CPEC loans to Pakistan are unfair, they are draining Pakistan's resources, etc. And they've started a propaganda war against Pakistan and against the Pakistan-China relationship. The Indians have gone one step further. I blame them. I believe that Indians are responsible for terrorist attacks that involve the Chinese against the Chinese, such as the attack on the Chinese consulate in Karachi and on other parts of Balochistan, which is meant to derail the CPEC project. Then they have come up with this accusation that Pakistan has provided a naval base to China in Gwadar and elsewhere, and that there is this string of pearls, which there isn't, but the string of pearls strategy that China has tried to pursue. It's in this kind of geopolitical environment that Pakistan and China are required to respond to this growing animosity by the United States and its strategic partner, India. Whereas so far, both Pakistan and China have been proposing a dialogue to India, seeking a better relationship with the United States. But our offers and those offers of the Chinese have been rejected, leading finally to this tough stance that the Chinese have taken vis-a-vis India and vis-a-vis the United States as well. And so this kind of new Cold War that has come into being is definitely going to affect our region, definitely going to affect our relationship with the major powers. And we should decide which side we are going to be on. I'm sure, I know that a lot of people in Pakistan are still trying to argue that we should have, our partnership with the United States. There is no partnership because there is no strategic convergence. They just need our help to get them a face-saving exit from Afghanistan. That's it. And we should realize that that's the extent of their interest in Pakistan as of now.
Sir, thank you very much. I think very comprehensively covered. Ms. Sitara, your question was also in the same context, but if you want to add something, go ahead, please.
Yes, sure.
Very
yes,
briefly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. To Mahin's question, I think as Ambassador Saab has already very clearly defined that China's role had been prominent, and China and Pakistan had, even if we look at China's approach, largely had been more of a cooperative nature vis-a-vis US as well as India. But now how the situation is developing, I think it's more than anyone, it's India and the US are to be blamed if China becomes confrontational, because they were being pushed in that corner. So if China's response towards, and if it's specifically about Pakistan's, China's help towards Pakistan, that has always been there. And over the time, that would only increase. And any external pressure would not actually affect that. And I think we also need to focus on how Chinese policies are evolving, how Chinese pattern vis-a-vis CPEC are evolving as well. Apparently, CPEC's focus is shifting even in Pakistan from infrastructural development to Digital Silk Road Initiative, which according to some analysts that have pointed out that which has a stronger military dimension. And perhaps that is why CPEC is receiving more visible and repeated American criticism lately, despite a perceived slowdown in the otherwise infrastructural CPEC-related projects. So I think Pakistan-China collaboration would only increase. And if we also take into account that more intelligence sharing agreement have taken place between China and Pakistan. And if also I take back to Chinese response during Pulwama Balakot crisis, there is a growing perception in the United States that China, who previously used to be on the US side, when it comes to India-China, diffusing India-Pakistan confrontation, China had always been with the United States in helping diffusing the tension or letting United States take the leading role. But Chinese role, according to many perceptions, the perceived role had been, according to many American officials, had been more advertently or inadvertently more provocative, or not really helpful, if I put it that way. So China definitely is taking larger role in India-Pakistan equation, as well as not only by helping Pakistan more in the strategic level, but also by somewhat changing nature of the CPAC that has probably raised greater concerns in the US as well as in India.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to re-emphasize the last statement, China is helping Pakistan at the strategic level. I'm sure that many would take it in a different direction, since this webinar was about nuclear. On nuclear side, what we do it on our own, because we know the kind of threat and we don't rely on any other country on strategic capability, and that's our history has been. And
thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, that's not what I meant. Yeah.
About no first use, there are two questions by Ms. Shiza Arif and Mr. Imran Rahman. Let me just briefly talk about that. No first use, first of all, it's not a legally binding commitment. States declare their nuclear policies to convey their intent, and of course, most states follow those intent, because unless you have a doctrine, you don't lay out your development plans and things like that. But in India's case, as Shiza, you asked that, will India review its no first use posture? I don't think so. It will officially review its posture, but it has created sufficient ambiguity in its stated position on no first use that its adversaries, Pakistan and possibly including China, they will have to take into consideration that in future there is a possibility that India might resort to a first strike, of a preemptive strike, because we never trusted their no first use. But after the statements of senior members of India's National Command Authority, or the Nuclear Command Authority as they say, there is sufficient ambiguity. And in terms of preparedness, I think when there is a doubt, there is always value or premium in taking precautionary measures, and that's what probably Pakistan will have to take into consideration, that India can get into this mischief, or could be encouraged by their, especially the scientist community, the DRDO and the military, that we can possibly contemplate this thing, which would be a very, very dangerous thing. And as I already said, the response from Pakistan would be with premium, and it will be more than what India would expect. With this, we will close this question answer session, and I'll request President Kass and Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat to give his concluding thoughts, observations, or make comments. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I must congratulate all the three speakers. They very ably answered all the questions that were put to them right at the beginning. And they also comprehensively addressed the questions that were posed in the Q&A session. It is not possible for me to summarize what has been said in 2 hours in 5 minutes. However, there are some important points made. I will only touch upon those. Ambassador Zamir Akram, in his basic remarks, said that the FSD cannot prevent skirmishes. This we must understand. People think that if Balakot or Uri kind of incident take place, Pakistan should quickly load up its missiles and be ready. That's not the intent. He also emphasized that the nuclear threshold is based on a certain criteria, and that criteria has been determined, or will be determined, in fact, because it's an evolving situation, after carefully deliberating over the pros and cons. So there is no automatic, nuclear threshold. Then he also emphasized very rightly the conventional capabilities that India is adding by the ballistic missile defense, etc., and the hypersonic weapons and so on, etc. So it's an ongoing, like I said, perhaps in my opening remarks, that since partition, this arms race has been going on. India creates a capability, Pakistan tries to catch up, and it catches up, then India adds to that capability and goes on and on. So on the other point that he made very rightly was that Indo-Pak engagement in the present situation is out of the question because India refuses to talk. And I personally think that Pakistan should not be begging India for talks, etc. If it doesn't want to engage, so be it. We can ignore them. We continue with what we think is in our best interest and which will ensure our security. And the lessons from the Cold War very rightly again pointed out that, the arms race ultimately becomes wasteful. It provides you a security during the transition period, but when the technologies move on, you find that expenditure is not wasteful in the past. But that's how it has been, and that is how it will remain. And another in the Q&A, a very important point made by him, and I think we all should understand this, that Pakistan is ambivalent in which direction it must take. You see, you can't be indecisive. When you come against a white folk, you have to decide whether you want to go right or you want to go left. So as he said, that there is no convergence of interest with America. It is transactional. It has always been transactional. Whenever America needed us, they came close to us. And when that need was fulfilled, it went away. While China has stood by us all along throughout our history, in good and in bad and in difficult situations, it has always supported us. So I just don't understand the reason for the ambiguity that we have with us. Coming to Dr. Adil's this thing, I think he made a very good point about what has motivated the development of nuclear capability on either side. For India, it has always been great power status and competition with China and prestige. Pakistan has just been trying to be secure, to save itself from, the machinations that India has always been doing. And one thing I want to, in the conventional domain, I would want to highlight that, the small little actions that India takes, it takes for the consumption of the media, because it's a small incident, whether it is Uri, whether it is Balakot, but the media runs away with it, And take the example of this pigeon story. I mean, it is so ridiculous that their channels were discussing this story with so much of enthusiasm as if Pearl Harbor has been attacked. They were so excited about it. So we have to be mindful that whatever next war or operations that take place will take place under the eye of the media. So when we determine our targeting, we have to keep in mind that what impact will it have on the media warfare or the information warfare that takes place subsequent to that small action that we take over there. Then I come to Ms. Tara's presentation. Again, she focused on a very important aspect of Pakistan's development, that is the peaceful nuclear development. And she outlined various activities that have gone on, which have helped in fields of medicine, health, agriculture, etc., which we usually don't take into account because whenever we talk about nuclear, we want to talk about nuclear weapons. But these achievements are important in their own right, and they need to be improved further. And upgradation, etc., has to take place. In the Q&A, there were these answers about the S-400. And again, Ambassador Zamir Akram highlighted that S-400 is not a magic weapon, that it will protect you against everything. We know that science limits things. There are low-level radars, there are medium-level radars, there are high-level radars, and there are other kinds of radars. And then when the Americans brought in stealth, these radars were useless. So you had to develop another kind of radars to detect stealth aeroplanes, etc. So again, this is the march of technology. You find a weapon and you then find an antidote. And so as 400 will have gaps, it is also applicable to the field of artificial intelligence. We again think that artificial intelligence is magic. No, artificial intelligence can only do one specific thing for a particular reason, for the particular need. So one artificial intelligence software will not look after all your needs. For every activity, for every domain, you have to develop a new algorithm, and that can be done. So there is no magic bullet, even in artificial intelligence, to do this. The human mind is versatile. It can, at a time, take on many activities simultaneously, but the artificial is not. Again, there was this question of no first use. Actually, the strong, powerful countries don't need the NFU. It is only the weak states, relatively less powerful people that have to defend themselves that go over there. And anyway, like Dr. Adil pointed out, it is a notion, you don't have to adhere to it. The nuclear weapons, or any weapons for that matter, are supposed to serve your security interests. They are supposed to protect you, and they will be used whenever their use is required to be optimum. So I personally don't buy too much into Indian NFU. It can be in discussions, etc., but ultimately I think everybody will use the weapons when they are required. So having said these things, have I left a point, important one? Okay, no. Now I'll just go over the a few points that I had written for myself. One thing that we understand from today's discussion is that it is obvious that life for Pakistan would have been even more difficult if Pakistan had not done what it did on 28 May 1998. We are very clear. The world powers were discriminatory then, and they are discriminatory now. India has a waiver from Nsg following the Indo-American nuclear deal, while Pakistan does not. The world's criticism of India's atrocities in Kashmir is muted due to economic and other considerations. As already pointed out by Ambassador Zamir Akram, the march towards arms control has been halted as treaties are being abandoned, and there is a deliberate effort to militarize, nuclearize, and colonize the space. USA has created a space force with the intent to mine the moon and other celestial bodies. The idea of a space as a common is being abandoned. The global security situation as a whole is becoming more and more volatile and unpredictable. We are in a situation where the nuclear armed countries have this overarching fear of the other. The Brookings Institute released a study in 2017 titled The Strategic Change, which was also referred to by Ambassador Zamir Akram. The purpose was to highlight that the nuclear linkage between the United States, China, India, and Pakistan. It is interesting to see that every country perceives itself to be the victim of mischief of a would-be aggressor. The result is an arms race, which has now reached outer space. What I find strange is that all apparently want to live in peace, but would not let others do the same. This is the dichotomy that exists forever. So it all proves the point that Little Hard made a long time ago. He said, and I quote, "To abolish war, we must remove its cause, which lies in the imperfection of human nature," unquote. So the likes of Mr. Trump, Modi, and Netanyahu must wage wars and come out victorious. This is that imperfect human nature that is behind all this chaos that exists in the world. In my judgment, the world finds itself in the most unstable position since the Second World War, because powerful countries are abandoning the rule-based order that they had created following that long, destructive war. Whether it is a storm created by Mr. Trump's America First policy, or it is here to stay for a longer time, we would only know from the result of the 2020 US elections in November. Mr. Trump's support for Mr. Modi has destabilized the South Asian region by Mr. Modi becoming ambitious and aggressive. The new great game is giving rise to new political strategic alignment, which have been alluded to by the speakers today. The attempt is to disrupt the Chinese rise through the outreach in the South China Sea and One Belt, One Road initiative. So this is both a challenge and opportunity for us. My fear is that we don't grab opportunities with a great deal of alacrity. We are busy with our own political infighting and don't have time for strategic initiatives. India is wanting to undo the CPEC project. I don't know what we are doing about it. There is a frenetic activity seen on the part of our adversaries, but the same kind of urgency is not evident on our side. The information warfare has to pick up speed. In Indian-sponsored webinars, they convey an impression that Pakistan and China have some very sinister plans up their sleeves, whereas the reality is that these two countries are just trying to deal with the Indian shenanigans of February and August 2019. India needs to understand finally that others can be pushed to the wall, and when there is no room for retreat, the pushed will resist with everything at their disposal. In the end, once again, I thank all the three speakers and all other participants for their patience and active participation in this webinar. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you for this, I think, comprehensive remarks. We now close this session, and my sincere apologies to all the participants who asked the questions, but we couldn't include those questions in our discussion session. I hope you will bear with this, because we had to limit this session for, it has already gone more than 2 hours. Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.